Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video we're going to be painting the axe for the Chaos Warrior that came in the Slaves to Darkness Army box, and the axe itself is going to be non-metallic metal steel, and the trim on it is going to be non-metallic metal gold. Now the gold is going to be quite similar to what's already been shown on the warrior on his armor, but the axe blade is going to be very different to the sort of steel look on the armor on that. So it's going to be different colors and different marks, different mark making on it. So that will hopefully make the like the metal on this part of the axe look different. So it just makes it a bit more interesting to look at with the different surfaces on the model. So even if it looks like it could be the same material, you can still have differences in how you paint it. To start with, I'm using neutral grey, and I'm just very quickly blocking in the highlight points. Now the colours will change as I go along. It's going to have like a very simple sky earth element to the reflections on it. It's not going to be super reflective. So usually when people say sky earth non-metallic metal, what they'll mean is chrome, which will mean that you're having quite sharp reflections, and like you'll be able to see sort of landscapes reflected in them. Whereas the sky earth kind of look that I'm going for here, it's still not polished to a mirror-like finish, but it will have a smoother look to it than the armor. So you can see as you look at the armor there, it's quite still textured, and there's not going to be that much texture visible on the axe. Mainly that's because I don't want to paint it as a chrome finish, and have to do like really hard reflections on there. I mean, it's an interesting painting challenge, but for this, I don't think it would be very suitable. It would just look a little bit weird, and I want it to match more a little bit to how I've painted the Chaos Warrior. So you can see here that I'm just adding in a little bit of the color first of all for the downwards facing sections. So if you look on the cutting edge of the blade, you can see that anything that is curved downwards is going to have some brown in it. You might have noticed at the very top of the cutting edge of the blade, I'd put some of the neutral grey in, and so that looks a little bit more like sky at that point, but it's not sky. The colours will change as it goes along, and also because I'm just putting it in very roughly, I just want sort of areas on the blade that just to separate things out and just to get some paint on it really. And don't worry too much about going really strong with the colours. I mean, don't go super strong, like don't go and pick say Mournfang brown and start painting in blocks of colour like that on the flat of the blade, because with the colour that strong, then it will start looking very similar to the gold trim, and you'll end up with a kind of a more golden looking axe. I mean, which again, if you want a gold axe, that's fine, but if you want to separate the two metals out, as I'm going to be doing in this, then don't go too heavy with the browns. But as we progress, when you see the style of the painting that I use, you will notice that most of the colours will become much more desaturated. You can see, so I was just talking about the Mournfang brown there, and I just used some straight from the palette and mixed it in, not mixed it in, like just straight from the palette onto the model, and you can see it's quite a strong brown at that stage. Here I've mixed in some ice yellow to the neutral grey. So if you look on the wet palette at the moment, just to go through some of the colours. So on the top row, at the top left, we have Balor brown. Next to that is ice yellow. Then we have white, whichever white you prefer, but I'm using P3 Morrow White. Then next to that is neutral grey mixed with ice yellow. Now I've just, on the wet palette there, you can see some Barroth blue just appeared. The Barroth blue is kind of similar in brightness to the ice yellow, but it's just a little bit brighter. Not to ice yellow, sorry, to the neutral grey mixed with ice yellow. But it's just because it turns out more white than when you add it on the model. So you can see there as I applied it, it does look almost white, but we will be going over the top of that again. At any stage when you might think, oh, that looks a bit weird, don't worry about it, because as we progress, as I said, things will blend together. This is just really for blocking colours in. So things like the neutral grey mixed with the ice yellow That's just a transition color, so I can go when I put the ice yellow on the brightest point on the blade, and you can see that it's around about halfway down, maybe just a bit higher than halfway down, because you want more of the brightness on the upper facing part of it, the upper curve. But you're going to just see like lots of blocks of color pretty much, and it looks kind of like a Neapolitan ice cream, you know. It's just going to be like blocks of color, and then at the little edges of them they'll transition together, and you can see there I've just put in a bit more. This was Mournfang brown mixed with neutral grey as well, so again this is a transition color between the two, because the Mournfang brown is quite dark and neutral grey is like a mid sort of color, and so I just wanted in between the two colors I wanted a sort of a bridge color, but that sort of grey brown color that I've got on the top curve of the axe blade there, it's way too strong at the moment. And again this is a very similar for the Barroth blue as well, so this, but the Barroth blue is slightly more important because it's adding the blue color of the sky in there, so and because this is going on the most important highlight on the axe blade, which is that really bright point, that's going to be the brightest highlight on the blade, and that will be the kind of like the focal point, and the reason I say that is because that's going to be like where the sort of you see the sun reflecting on it. I have got elements of blue on the lower curve, which isn't technically accurate, because if it's so you see that lower curve just here where the paintbrush is touching, that wouldn't reflect much in the way of sky at all. That should be mostly ground color, but I'm just adding extra sort of bands of color in there, and again, so I'll be tweaking them as we go along, but it will just add more reflections on there to make it look more interesting. You can still see that I'm saying horizontal brush marks at the minute, and the reason I say horizontal is because I'm holding that for me, as I'm holding the model, it's a little bit more tilted, so when I'm painting it, these are sort of like horizontal brush strokes for me, but it's sort of, they look vertical on the video, and when I go to sort of blend the lines together, which you'll see a bit later on, I'll be using what look like horizontal lines but will actually be vertical for me, because I'm dragging the brush towards myself, whereas at the moment I'm doing kind of like sideways brush marks. You can see, so more colors have now appeared on the wet palette as well. The color that I'm using here is Rhinox hide, and again this is just darkening down some of those areas, because although Mournfang brown was the darkest color on there, apart from any black primer showing, the Rhinox hide is obviously a lot darker than the Mournfang brown. The Mournfang brown just adds a bit too much saturation, but it works nicely to add a bit of colour on there as well, and it matches nicely with the ice yellow for the sort of warm reflections. You can just see there that I had some of the Barroth blue, and I'd mixed that with black. And again, that's just a bridge colour, so I can kind of get a bit of a transition in between the pure Barroth blue highlight blocks that I've put in and any of the darker colours next to them, because you will struggle to blend the colours together when it's like a bright highlight colour right next to a dark one, and there will be bright colours next to dark ones. It's mainly at the very edge is where you transition them. You don't want to get like long slow transitions between each colour, so if it's going from brown to grey to blue, you don't want to have each transition looking the same size, going all the way like a really slow soft transition, just going like, and it'll be like it won't just be blocks of colour, it'll just be like a smooth gradient going between them. That'll be the wrong way to do it. It won't look shiny, it'll just look like a smooth gradient, so it'll look good still as long as you paint it really neat, but it won't really look like metal. I mean, it might look like some sort of kind of metals, but then it would mean that the light has become very diffused over the surface. Whereas to get the shiny effect, you need really fast transitions. So you'll get like a size and shape of a highlight, and then the transition is a tiny fraction of space in between one sort of block of highlight color and one sort of darker reflection. And then the more that this surface becomes like a mirror reflection, the faster the transition becomes, until you don't really see a transition, and it's just like a hard mirror reflection. So if you'd see trees or ground or whatever, and you'd see the exact shapes in there, the more diffused the lighting is, so the softer the transition, because it softens the image more. And so if you imagine something becoming more out of focus, if you took like a camera lens, so it's in focus, that's the mirror finish. The more you turn the dial so it becomes out of focus, that softens the image, and it becomes harder and harder to make out what the image is. And that takes it more away from a mirror reflection, and it sort of changes the material surface that you're trying to paint, or trying to replicate. And you get to really soft transition, and then it might as well be like, I don't know, sand or anything like, or wool or something, like really soft, sort of blurry transitions that you won't really see what the object is at all, and you just get like a rough indication of a highlight and shadow on there. So I'm still going back to the ice yellow and neutral grey mix. I'm going to be going backwards and forwards between a lot of these colours. So you'll notice in this video that I'm not mixing on top of colours that I've already got, at least most of the time anyway. So in some of the previous videos, what I've been doing is picking a colour, and then as I go through the highlight steps, just adding more colour to it. So it could either be a highlight or a shadow, but just keeping in that like one little colour spot and just adding more paint to it each time. Whereas for this one, I've gone back to how I most commonly paint. So I just mix, or rather I have all the colours mixed ready on the palette, because it just gives me more options for going backwards and forwards. And the reason for that is because I wasn't entirely sure exactly how I wanted the blade to look. And as I'm going along, I will be making changes to it. So, little tweaks here and there, or just moving highlight points around, or putting in extra reflections. Now, if I've gone through my transitions on one little colour spot, it's a lot harder to do that, to go and find the original colour that I wanted to add, if I want to add extra reflections on there. Whereas doing it like this, it takes up a lot more space on the wet palette, and it uses more paint as well, but it does mean that you can, go back between colours as and when you want to. But the thing is, it can be harder to blend like this, because when you're adding like small amounts of paint to a colour that's already on the wet palette, then you can just add like a very small amount each time, so you get lots and lots of layer transitions, so you can get a very smooth transition much more easily. Whereas when you do it like this, you can see all the colours quite distinctly on the wet palette, and so there are very obvious steps between each colour, which means that when you're doing the transition, you just have to spend a lot more time doing like little tiny marks on there. So it's like stippling, kind of cross hatching, little bits like that. But this isn't even the final style of blending. As I said, so it's still mostly, I'm going to say horizontal again. It's not really, so it's sort of dragging towards me a little bit, but it's going towards the left as I do the pull down motion. Try and keep most of the brush marks going in the same direction, because then when I put the more blended marks on top of it, they're going to be basically cross hatching on top of it, which will just help sort of blend the lines all together. You can see that I'm also mainly just using the tip of the brush as well, so I'm back to using the size 00 still, and that was again the same for when I did most of the painting on the Chaos Warrior on these armor and trim as well. When I say size 00, that's an artist opus size 00. Different manufacturers vary the sizes depending, so you can have a 00 in, say, like Winsor & Newton or Broken Toad, or whatever brush manufacturer you prefer to use, and their sizes will all be different, even though they'll have the same number on. But you can get a good idea, I think. Like size 00 is quite a small brush with a sharp point on it. And again, you can see here as I'm applying the colours, I keep going backwards and forwards. Now, what I usually recommend is when you're doing these marks, paint towards sort of like the centre, like if it's a highlight, and paint towards well, you're always painting toward, like if it's a highlight, you're painting towards the brightest part, and if it's a shadow, you're painting towards the shadow, because wherever you take the brush off, it leaves a little bit of excess paint, so you'll build up those parts quicker. Whereas if you are painting a highlight and you paint away from the highlight, you'll build up the highlight quicker on a part that's further away from the highlight, so it'll end up going light, dark, light, because you'll have more paint away from the highlight point that you want to highlight than having the paint closer to it. And the reason that it will go light, dark, light with the excess paint is because you're increasing the opacity. It's basically more paint in one area, which blocks the light showing the paint from the layer beneath. Which is kind of like making it overly complicated, but basically if you're painting a highlight, paint the brush marks towards the highlight, and if you're painting a shadow, paint the brush marks towards the shadow. In terms of paint consistency for this, you don't want to be too thin. The more that you get towards the blended section, the more water you want to add to it. But to start off, when you're just going to kind of block in the colours, and even a little extent towards some of the blending as well, you want around about 50-50 water to paint. It might feel a little bit thick. You do need to test it before you apply it to the model, so run it on your thumb or a tile, or whatever you have, just to see that the paint still flows. You need the paint to flow smoothly, but you also want it to make like kind of an obvious mark. You'll know that you've thinned it too much because it'll look sort of more like a heavy glaze, and you'll end up taking a long time to do it. You're not going to necessarily make a big problem if you over thin it, but it will mean that it'll take longer, and you run the risk of making the transition too smooth. And I mean, you shouldn't really have that issue that you make the transition too smooth, as long as you've got the blocks of highlight correctly. If you keep the blocks of highlight the same size and just work on the transition between the two blocks of color, you should be all right. But the temptation will be with the thinner paint that you can spread out the transition a little bit more, because it will look very smooth, and you'll be like, oh, that looks really smooth, I want to keep pushing that element so it looks really nice and clean and smooth, and then you suddenly lose that sort of shine element. So really focus on keeping the blocks of color and just get the transitions at each side, so the top and bottom of each highlight. And again, you can keep seeing me go backwards and forwards. Remember, at the beginning of the video, or closer to the beginning of the video, I said the curve at the bottom of the axe shouldn't be that heavily blue, and you can see now that I've removed a lot of the blue look to it, whereas the curve just above the bright highlight, which I'd taken up to ice yellow at the moment, and you can see here I'm just adding a bit of ice yellow again. That's where the strongest blue element is. So, and remember, this, as I mentioned before, is the brightest highlight on the axe, the most important one, and there will be a shine spot on this as well, and the shine spot will transition over between the flat of the blade and the edge of the blade. Quite often I've seen people do this, if they're painting an axe or a sword or something, and they'll leave the flat of the blade black and just paint the edge as a highlight. It's kind of a cheat when you do that, because you're just leaving the flat of the blade black and then doing an edge highlight all the way around. And the reason it's a cheat is because you're just going for the high contrast light next to dark, and especially in photos it'll make things stand out. But if you see that in the flesh, the problem is that it looks unpainted. You've just got like a big flat black area. Not necessarily a problem, because like if you're doing it for tabletop painting, or you just don't want to spend too much time on it, it'll have a super high contrast and stand out nicely from a distance. But if you look at it close up, there's just nothing to look at on the black part of the weapon. So this is sort of pushing it a little bit more towards, I hesitate to say realism, but making it more interesting to look at, because you will see like paint transitions and reflections on sort of all parts of the blade. Now, I mentioned before, so on the flat of the blade, it's a little bit tricky in terms of the highlight placement because there's not really a rule as such about where they go. Because so if it was a mirror finish, like any sort of reflection naturally there, I think this is tilted slightly downwards, so it's more likely to just show the ground reflecting on it. But like if you took a mirror outside and you just tilt it a little bit down or a little bit up, you can vastly change the reflection that you see on there. And so really it's entirely up to you how you want to represent these reflections on there, because if you so realism might say, oh, it's just reflecting off the ground, and then you're not going to get any sort of nice colours or reflections on the flat of the blade, and it's only again going to be the edge of the blade because it curves up slightly that's going to show any reflections on there. So really you want to spend a little bit of time just putting random reflections in, and I mentioned how I line them up against the cutting edge of the blade. Now there's one really big problem with doing this, is that non-metallic metal works best with light next to dark, high contrast. So I've already mentioned how people leave the flat of the blade black, and that will make the highlight points on the cutting edge of the blade stand out way more, especially when you put the little shine dot on. With that shine dot will suddenly look super high contrast if you take that up to white and it's right on next to, or half of it at least will be on the flat black part of the blade. And especially when you take a photo of that will just suddenly look like it's glowing like incredibly brightly, having that super high contrast. And when I mentioned that if you try and match up the highlights on the flat of the blade next to the cutting edge of the blade, then you're actually going to destroy that opportunity to have light next to dark. So when I say they match up, they kind of a little bit match up, but not entirely. So I'll have like little patches of dark next to them, and again I'll be tweaking it as I go along, just so that I can force areas to look brighter or darker depending on their position, being next to something. And also it'll allow me, because the flat of the blade has some runes on it, so it's nice to have some darker sections on the flat of the blade near the runes, because that will allow the edges to be picked out brightly and be high contrast on those as well. But it also is nice to have a little bit of a lighter part on the flat of the blade on some of the runes, so it will show like a variation in surface reflection. And again, it helps to trick the eye into making it look like a metallic surface. It's all very much about finding balance, and it's not the easiest thing to do. Like the more complicated that you make the reflections and the more colors that you add, the harder it is to balance everything. So it's like a little juggling act, and if you try and add too much to it, you're just going to drop everything and make a mess. So like the simplest way to do non-metallics is literally just using grey, black, or like black and white and grey, and doing like a high contrast black flat of the blade, shiny cutting edge, looks great on photos and from a distance because it's high contrast. You start adding colors, start adding extra reflections, then you start having to take into account realism, but also ignoring realism where it makes it look worse, or just adding some of your own artistic preferences in there and just what you think looks good. And that's where the real problem starts, is what you think looks good and what actually looks good. But ultimately, for that kind of painting, your opinion overrules everyone else's. So you might get feedback online and someone might be like, oh, I don't like that. What they'll actually say when they don't like it is that it's wrong, which is the most annoying feedback that I think you can get, because they're confusing their preference for fact. If you like something and you purposely painted it that way, then it's correct regardless of how other people view it, because ultimately you're painting these things for your own preference and your own enjoyment. So if you like how something looks, then that's exactly how it should look. Just to get back to what I'm doing a little bit here, so remember where the blue well, it's kind of like a bluey green. So especially adding the black to the Barroth blue, it just makes it look a bit more greeny. It's not like super green, but and also because there is some ice yellow in there as well, you got a little bit of a mix of the yellow and blue, sort of adding to that kind of greeny feel to it. But on that brightest block of basically ice yellow, you can see that I've added a couple of extra sort of lines in there. These are still quite harsh at the moment. They will be softened over later with a little bit of glazing. And you might think at the moment, oh, you've been messing around with some of these colours and just keep going over and over sections, but it's all just tweaking until I find a balance that I'm happy with. So I have the concept in my head of how I want it to look, but I don't have the exact details, which is usually how I like to paint most of my models. So I have a concept, I have an atmosphere in my head, which will involve the colours I want to use, and just then I start applying the colours and then I tweak it as I go along, making sure everything's balanced, or just they look how I prefer them to look. But what I'm doing on that section there is, so the blue I mentioned earlier on, the colours look like sort of like Neapolitan ice cream, like really strong blocks of colour, and quite garish almost with how they're all placed together. Now I'm sort of with the blending and highlighting and just adding extra marks and reflections, I'm taking away a lot of that saturation, so it just looks a lot more subtle. The colours are still quite strong, but as we go along, it's more going to be mixed colours. So you see less of the pure Barroth blue, less of the pure Mournfang. Like, you can't see any pure Mournfang really on there now, but it's still there as a hint with the brown, especially transitioning on the lower section of the ice yellow that went into below that. So that's where it's mixing in the neutral grey, and there's a bit of brown in there as well. The brown in the mix between Mournfang brown and neutral grey still adds a bit of warmth to that neutral grey colour, and that then blends in really nicely with the lower part of the ice yellow block. Then at the top of the ice yellow block, it's where it gets a bit more complicated, because there's a darker section there which is Barroth blue mixed with black, and then there's sort of a line where I've got some ice yellow, and so these lines help to kind of trick you into thinking that it's blended, because obviously it's quite a harsh transition between the two, but just having that little line there kind of disguises the fact that it's a block of colour, and again I'm taking away more of the sort of the bluey greeny look as well. And then I keep going back and adding more again at the transition points. It's all about getting the transition points soft while keeping the big block of colour, and then just spending time knocking things back or pushing things forward. It's a lot of messing about. Remember when I talked about the blending marks and how I was doing a lot of horizontal marks, even though they didn't look horizontal in the video, but it was more me pushing the brush sort of left or right. Here I'm pushing, or rather pulling the brush, so it's more like dragging it towards me, and this sort of overlaps with the previous brush marks. It makes it like a cross-hatching section, but you can't see any cross-hatching marks on there. It really disguises the previous brush marks and actually makes it look neat and blended together. You can see as well that I'm pushing on the ice yellow section here, so I'm taking up to white now. Remember, this is P3 Morrow White, but any white will do. It's just, I mean, I keep saying this every video. I just have a certain amount of P3 Morrow White that I bought. I'll probably switch to another white paint when that one runs out, just to prove that you don't need to use P3 Morrow White. But it is a nice, fairly smooth colour in terms of white, because white's a terrible colour to paint, but it is a fairly nice white to use. But you can see on the block of ice yellow there, so the top part of it is much more bright, and I've taken that all the way up right next to the transition into the Barroth blue mixed with some black. So that's a really tiny area for such a big tonal jump between the white now and the Barroth blue mixed with black. And that little line there that was ice yellow and now it's got a bit of white on it as well really helps with that little transition area. You can also see that I've gone and added some, I'm using Vallejo model black, but you can use any black. Abaddon black is also quite nice. Abaddon black will give you a more or a darker look to it because it has a slightly satin finish. Model color black will, because it's more matte, will be a little bit of a softer black, probably closer to a grey color, but it's still pretty black. It just has a nicer finish for my preferences. You're not going to see a massive difference, but if you want a really dark black, then go for the Abaddon black, because it'll have like a shiny element to it, which, because of the way light works with a shiny surface, it'll make it look darker. Now you can see that I'm going to be working on the shine spot on the flat of the blade, and you can notice the marks I'm making here are quite different to how I've been painting on the cutting edge of the blade. So this is more of a stippling element. The reason it's going to be more stippled is because there's not one particular direction of mark for the reflections. So if I just do stippling, like I could just paint them all still like in a big circle, making almost like a star shape with the little reflections, keep pulling them towards the center, but it's actually a bit of a pain to do something like that, whereas you can do stippling and build it up and then have a little bit of glazing on top and still get a pretty neat smooth finish. One of the kind of important thing is to separate the cutting edge of the blade between the flat of the blade with the line. So it's already got sort of an edge sculpted on there with it. There's a nice little bit of battle damage, some scrapes on there as well. The scrapes are a godsend because you can put a really bright highlight on there and then a dark section where it sort of cuts into the blade, and that creates a really strong high contrast highlight point and shadow point, and helps, especially if it's in a darker area, that will work as a shine point as well. So part of the reason you're adding the really dark recess point on that is because it will again push that high contrast and make it look like a shiny little spot. You're going to be using the same colors that you've used on the brightest part on the curve of the blade on the shine spot, and the brightest part of the shine spot needs to match in exactly with the brightest point on the cutting edge of the blade, and you want to get rid of the dark edge. So you can see, so I just mentioned the sculpted on edge between the cutting edge of the blade and the flat of the blade. There is naturally a little dark edge next to that as I've been painting, just because of the way that I've applied the paint, and I want the very sharpest cutting point on the blade to also be bright white, and so it's a little bit darker towards the that edge on the that connects the flat of the blade to the cutting edge of the blade. I'm hoping all this makes sense. I'm having to say a lot of words, but so this little section here, and you can where I'm painting in the little spot shine highlight, little specular highlight, right next to that on the right hand side, it looks like a little dark line that has to be painted over, because what you're wanting to represent will be the glare of the shine spot. The glare will take away any of the details around it, but it's the only way you can do that is just by building up the paint layers and getting a really opaque finish and taking it up to white. I mean, you'll see as I go along how it's done. And also for the shine spot, try and keep it round, because you are basically representing the sun, and the sun's a big round ball of fire, so it's going to have a round circular shape as the highlight point, especially on the flat of the blade, so the shape of the surface isn't going to distort it very much, and because of the natural glare anyway, it should still be a pretty round circle. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, it could be all sorts of imperfections around there, but especially for the final highlight point on the shine spot that you're doing, it will be a round dot. But don't worry too much if you've made the highlight a little bit too big, because you can knock it back. You've got all the other colours on the wet palette still. But just be aware that if you've done a really big block of highlight colour like I have here, if you start cutting it back with the darker colours at the edges, they're going to make a really strong visual impact. Basically it'll look too strong, and you'll just have to spend time blending at the edges again together. And it's just going to be a case of going backwards and forwards until you get a transition shape and opacity that you're happy with. So you can see I'm just going to put in a little quick highlight spot here. You're not going to see me spend too much time blending it in, but I was just looking at that part on the model and thought, because there's that little highlight on the cutting edge of the blade right next to it, having I've just mapped it in for future reference, so that I know that I want to put a little bit of a highlight in there as well. And there you could see when I was talking about that little cut, battle damage on the blade, and it's really nice because it crosses over from the flat of the blade onto the cutting edge of the blade, and it allows you to put that pure white little dot, that shine dot, on where it touches the edge of the connection between the two parts of the blade. And so here you can see where I'm doing a similar sort of thing, even though there's no battle damage. This is the shine spot, so I'm taking it up to pure white. You can see where I'm trying to get rid of any of the dark line in between the two sections of the blade as well. And I'm just going to be going over and over it until I get a really strong opaque finish there, and so it looks like a really bright white shine spot. Also at this stage, when you're adding these final kind of highlights on these parts, you probably want the paint a little bit thinner, so it's closer to 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. But that really does depend on your own particular paint brand, how long you've had the paint pot open and things like that. But just check it. It's always a case of just check it, but just check it on your thumb or tile or whatever. See if you can make a mark, if it's too soft. Too soft in this case will mean that you won't get a sharp highlight. So while it's on the very border on the consistency of the mark, a good indication of the mark that you're making will be on that, not on the brightest part of the cutting edge of the blade where the white all blends in, but on the mark that I just made there. So you can see I'm going over it. When I applied the white on that little bit there, it was too bright in comparison to the area around it. So then I have to go back with the other colors and just blend them in, but I still have the white part there because I'm not going over the brightest part, but it just blends the transition. Also, you want an edge highlight going down the very sharpest front edge part of the cutting edge of the blade. You want the white highlight on any area on the cutting edge of the blade that's white. You want an edge highlight to the right hand side of that covers all of the white area, and then trail it a little bit further out than that, because edge highlights catch more light than sort of a flat surface. And then as it goes further around, just pick one of the slightly darker colours. So it could be the neutral grey mixed with ice yellow, or whichever colour you want to go for that's just duller than the white, and then put that over the other parts of the blade, but just so that it picks out an edge highlight to show the reflections. That shine spot that I put on the flat of the blade that was next to the brightest point on the cutting edge of the blade, the amount of times I have to say this, so that shine spot that I put on, that's going to be the only bright shine spot with transition on the flat of the blade. The rest of it isn't going to be taken much higher than Barroth blue, even if it goes up to Barroth blue. It's like very subtle highlights. So some of them may be Barroth blue, some of them might be neutral grey mixed with ice yellow. It's really up to your preference where you put them. but just try and make them look interesting. The bits that you're going to be relying on are the hard edges on the runes. So you can see here, and I'm picking these out with, again, it's most likely going to be ice yellow mixed with neutral grey. But it does depend on the colour around them. So if it's in a darker area, you might even just go with neutral grey. On the brighter area, it's going to be neutral grey mixed with ice yellow. On the brightest parts, it's going to be pure ice yellow. And even on some parts, maybe on like the spiky parts of the text, you probably put a little white dot on it for, again, little tiny shine spots on there. While I was painting the flat of the blade earlier on in the video, you probably noticed I was being a bit messy and not paying that much attention to paint going into the text, like the recesses on it. That isn't really a problem, because so even neutral grey on there, it's still quite dark in comparison to a nice yellow edge highlight. So you'll still have a high contrast and it'll still look neat as long as you keep the edge highlights neat that go around it. You know, you don't have to worry about a little bit of paint that's got into some of those recesses. I mean, you can fix it if you want, but it's really not going to make that much of a difference. And also so the temptation is probably to just use some watered down black paint, fill that in there, and it'll flood the area, which will work fine. But you always risk, if you do something like that, just getting a little bit of paint over the edge, and then you have to tidy it up, and it's really just not worth the effort when you see that just painting in an edge highlight all the way around the text does the same kind of job. And also it is sort of more interesting as well, because although they are recesses, and they're quite harsh recesses as well, so they will mostly be dark, but on the areas where you have got paint in them, they are on areas where you've painted highlight bands on the flat of the blade. So naturally, a little bit more light probably would get into those recesses. So having them a little bit lighter in there isn't wrong either. But it just really depends on how neat and tidy you want to be on it as well. So you can see I'm just going around picking out all of the right, so I say the edge highlights on the text, or the runes, it's the lower and side edges, anything that matches with the direction of the lighting, you know, so it's kind of like top down lighting. You know, any of those edges you pick out with the brighter highlights. You can pick out some of the upper edges with the really dull highlights, so probably sticking to neutral grey, but just don't go too crazy with them. So now I'm going to be really knocking back some of the highlights on the lower curves. And you can see I've got some Rhinox hide on the wet palette there. So right at the very top of the wet palette, you can see there where the brush just dabbed into it. It's watered down, around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. And so all I did was, so usually when I'm doing glazing, I'll use a well palette, which is just, you know, basically what it has is a little well with paint mixed with water. But because I only need such a small amount of paint, I just add water to the wet palette. You can do the same thing, so you can glaze with water from with paint from a wet palette, and it's just, you know, thin down paint. And you don't need an exact mix, but you need to have a rough estimation of, or like a rough idea of the sort of mark it's going to make. It looks quite dark on the wet palette, but you can see as I apply it to the model, you can quite clearly see it's thin. And because I want it to be darkest at the bottom, I'm brushing into the shadows. So remember I was talking about this earlier. If you're painting a shadow, you paint in towards the shadow. Do not at all try and paint these towards the highlights, so the brightest parts on the axe. You will ruin the highlight by doing that, and it'll make it look dirty and grubby, and you get like coffee stain effects on there. Just off the top of the wet palette there, you saw I took some of the ice yellow. I'm just doing the same thing, so I added a load of water to it. It's around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. Be a little bit more careful with the ice yellow because it's quite easy to get sort of a texture build up, and you like get a staining effect on there as well. But you are painting not over the white, but any area that's sort of lightish and then paint towards the white, but then take the brush off before you go over the white. If you have excess paint, you can always sort of clean the brush and dab it a little bit just to kind of, you know, fudge it into the transition a bit. But if you find you do go over the white with this, it's not the end of the world in that case, and you just have to go back with some of the white and neaten it up a little bit. But yeah, you are going back, you know, just glazing over some of these areas just to soften all the transitions. So you can clearly see now the downwards facing curves on the cutting edge of the blade. They look much darker now. And again, just going back in there. Also, so I've just done it there, and I'm actually taking it up to black. So remember, I'm using Vallejo model color black, but you can use a Baden black as well. And it's really, really knocked down, especially this downwards facing curve highlight. Knocked down the brightness of the highlight, but it's also desaturated it. So you remember when I first started that, there was really strong browns and blues on there, and now they look much more subtle. Also, when you're picking up the models, don't do like I just did and pick it up by the axe, the axe blade that you just spent a couple of hours painting, because you really risk getting oils from your hand onto the model, and the oils will eat into the paint. But also, if you leave oil deposits on the paint, on the sort of like the primed area, it makes the paint harder to stick to it, and it's likely that you will end up with pooling, especially if you're using thinner paint. But that's the end of the sort of the non-metallic steel part of the video, and from now on I'm just going to be working on the non-metallic gold part, so the trim all around the axe. And well, I say all around, it's going to be on the front side. So for this video, I've just focused on painting one side of the axe. I'm going to paint the other side in my own time. I am painting the whole of this model. I know quite often people get accused, especially pro painters get accused of only painting one side of the model. In many cases that can be true, purely because we have to put out things for tutorials and social media, and you can own, like, once you've done the video or the PDF or whatever on the section that you're showing, that's, you know, you can't make more content from painting the rest of it. So, you know, when you're trying to make content, make people happy, then it's quite hard to spend time painting the rest of something that you're not going to be able to do anything with. However, I really like this model. I'm going to be finishing off because I think it looks really cool. There's always a difference when you're painting a model that you think is really nice and fun to paint versus one that you're just showing it for a tutorial. For the brush marks that I'm working on here, so I'm starting off with XV88, and this is a pretty simple painting really. I am keeping it quite similar to the gold trim on the armor. But it's going to be, in some places, it's going to be a little bit more heavily, not really text, it's sort of scratchy to fix the transitions. So especially on the cylindrical part of the axe, you can see where the little spikes are on, you know, on the shaft of it. That has, because I'm painting multiple highlights on there, of these long straight highlights, and it'll go like light, dark, you know, going all the way around it. So depending on which angle you look for, there's always going to be like a highlight and a shadow part next to each other to sort of represent kind of very rough reflections. The problem is if you just leave it like that on a very basic level, just with these black lines and then highlight lines, again, it looks all right on photos, but in reality it just looks like you painted stripes on something, because you don't benefit from the glow of like, you know, LCD screens and things like that. So you do need, you know, when you're looking at the model in the flesh, to have some sort of transition in there, or just some sort of detail. So what I will be doing is just painting sort of little scratches all over it, just to kind of fill in the area and make it look like I've actually put some detail on there. The reason that I'm not putting in like a strong transition, so, you know, when I was doing the cutting edge and the flat edge of the blade and all that kind of nonsense, I was talking about having a little tiny transition in between the two parts. It's the problem is on the gold part here, when you're trying to do that kind of thing, it's such a small area. I will be doing it a little bit, but and also it's kind of like uninteresting area, and as it gets darker down towards where he's holding the axe, you know, that sort of that darker bit down there, because you're not taking you know, adding brighter highlights there, you're sort of limited with the darker colors that you're using, and you still need to be able to do something to fill the space. So I mean, you'll see how I do it anyway. At the moment I'm still using the XV88, just picking in areas, looking for little reflection points. What I mainly did was hold it under a lamp to see where the majority of the highlight goes, and you can see that will also match roughly up, not ideally, but kind of closely-ish to the highlight points on the flat of the blade and the cutting edge of the blade. Basically, sort of the middle part of the skull is going to be nice and brightly highlighted. Then as we get further away from that, it's not going to have quite as much attention to it, but because there are sort of sharp edges like and details and things sculpted on all over where the non-metallic gold goes, it will have a lot more edge highlights on with bright spots on them, just because naturally the edge highlights will catch more light on them. But it is, fortunately, the sculpting on the little skull demon thingy on the axe head is really nicely done with all these shapes. So it's not just a flat surface with a sculpted on skull. The skull itself has like little undulations, it curves, some really nice little kind of indentations with a bit of a highlight raised lip next to it, particularly on, you know, the elliptical kind of areas around there. It's all got these really nice little touches on the sculpting, so it just makes it a lot easier and nicer to paint. There you could just see, and you see a little bit more now, what I was talking about with filling in the area between the light highlights and the black line right next to them. So I'm just doing those little sort of scratchy marks, which they work quite nicely on it. They help to separate out the gold material from the axe, the cutting part of the axe as well, or basically from the gold and the non-metallic steel. And I guess what that means is that he spends a little bit more time polishing the cutting part of the axe and doesn't care so much about the gold part. But it's still, in terms of looking at it just for making it interesting, it is kind of nice having the separate textures on there. So there's a slightly more zoomed out look, because you spent so much time looking at it zoomed in. Sometimes you kind of forget how the model actually looks when you hold it in your hand. So you can see like how nicely blended and detailed it looks when you've not got it right up in your face. You know, just to help visualize about what it looks like. Now I'm zooming back in so you can actually see the brush marks. But it is always handy, I find, while I'm painting, because so I don't use a headset, but I am short-sighted. I am going to do a video on using headsets and what I think of them, and going through a few options as well. But what I do find is if you've got something right up in your face and you're painting all these fine details on it a lot, it's very easy to get focused on those fine details and not look at the model as a whole overall. So, you know, what I'm representing here with the zoomed out shot is that you need to stand back from the model a little bit, just to look at how it works overall, see if the focal points are looking good, and also like the light volumes and things like that. You know, when you're painting like a high-end display piece, it's not just about painting in details. You know, you have to make sure that just the atmosphere and the light and the, you know, all that kind of good stuff is also represented nicely on the model. So now I've moved up to Balor Brown for the highlights, or first stage highlights rather. And you're pretty much doing the same thing again that you've just done with the XV88, but in a smaller area. The brightest point on the gold is going to be on the forehead and cheeks of the skull shape. So it's moved up a little bit higher than where the brightest spot is on the cutting edge of the blade. But part of the reason for that, so I was talking about on the sculpting, like how, you know, the nice undulations and details that are sculpted onto it. So it has upwards facing surfaces. I'm not sure how well you can see them on the video, but because it's very three-dimensionally sculpted and not a flat shape of a skull that's just put on there, it does have these upwards facing surfaces that would catch naturally more light than the flat and downwards facing parts than the flat of the blade. You can also see that I'm just trying to paint in some little, they're kind of like bounce highlights, but not really. I mean, sort of really, but you know, so you paint the primary highlights on, and they're fairly easy to work out. You know, just look where the light naturally falls on the model, and then tweak it to your own preference. But you get all these other areas that are left in black, or where the sculpting connects with the flat of the blade, and it'd be quite a dark section there. So then you're taking, you know, painting very fine lines to represent bounce highlights that help to give definition and shape, and just, you know, makes it look a little bit better and detailed. It's not something that you would ever really want to do on tabletop painting. It's purely for display painting, or because you want to practice or something like that, or you want to show off with maybe an army commander. You know, it's something that's, you have to look really close at the model to see, basically. But it's I do find it, you know, it's quite fun to put in those little extra details, and it does help, you know, when looking at it closely, just to see where the light would bounce up. So obviously when the light from the blade would reflect back onto parts of the skull, it would create these little highlight points. For these oval shapes here, again, you're picking the lower edges. So as the light goes down, it's an upwards facing edge. Upwards facing edges will catch more of the light, but you can paint, and you can see how I did when I painted with the XV88. I pretty much picked out all of the edge highlights on here, so it's kind of being lazy with your painting, because I'm leaving a lot of the black primer to do the work, and then putting scratchy textures over the top, filling in between the edge highlights. And then there's just a few areas where I've painted in light volumes, like I say, so that, you know, on the shaft and on the big bright parts on the forehead and the cheeks of the skull, areas like that. But all the other parts on the gold trim are pretty much just edge highlighted, and then the middle sections are filled in with scratching. And then you take it a step further, and so with the Balor Brown here, you're picking out any upwards facing edge, or just like interesting reflections and high sharp edge highlights and things, just to pick out details. I actually find on Chaos weapons, because they're so covered in spikes, they can be a complete pain to paint, because you get all these little like bright edges all over them, and sometimes you just have to kind of force yourself to not paint them all. I mean, if you're painting like heavy metal style, then you can paint them all, because then it, you know, they're all equally bright, and you're just picking out all the details. So what you'll end up with is something that looks like kind of super hyper detailed. But if you want to paint it in more of like a realistic lighting method, then picking out all of the edge highlights to the same brightness will actually be detrimental to the effect you're going for, because you'll lose all your focal points with the bright highlights, and you know, you just won't be able to. Your eye won't naturally be drawn to the, you know, the nice bright highlights on the model. Here you can see with the Balor Brown as well, picking out the edge highlight at the top. I'm going to be filling in quite a lot of the top of the cylindrical shaft section on the gold trim part anyway. The bit where the model's holding it, so he's got like a leather wrap of some sort, and I'll probably do the section in between the gold and the leather wrap as non-metallic steel, but I won't make it as shiny as the cutting edge. I'm not sure if I'll include that in the video or not. There's not that much more on the model that will be painted differently. So he's got things like his hair the horns, maybe the horn bit on the shoulder pad and the cloth on the front. There's not a vast amount of different parts to paint on the model, but so probably will only be one more video on this, and then maybe a base as well if I do a more interesting base where I might sculpt one for it. Then actually, like, if the model looks good enough when it's got all put together and it's got a base on, I might just stick him in as a Golden Demon entry, not expecting to get anything, but just to see how he does. I've got a lot of other entries that I want to get finished first, including the vampires. I'm still doing little bits here and there on Kado Ezekiah to go in with my vampire unit, which is coming on slowly, but I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on some, because I have to put in another couple of vampires to that as well, to get a nice squad of 5, so they all look nice together. And then I've got my Titan for Adeptus Titanicus. It's going to be the Nurgle converted Titan, and I really want to get started on that as well. And then I'm also doing an Ogroid from the Slave to Darkness box. It's going to be an Ogroid champion, so cut off the details on the shield. You may have remembered that I did at one point paint one of the previous, it's an Ogroid Myrmidon, and that came with the shield, and I did a similar thing on that where I cut off the details and did a freehand Scorpion on it. But I'm going to do a similar sort of thing where I've cut off the details on another Ogroid champion, and it's going to have a freehand image on the shield, but it's not going to be a Scorpion, and he's going to be probably painted up as a Golden Demon piece. I just need to check which category he goes in. I think it might be a monster category because he's quite large, but I guess we'll see. You can see here I've just been pushing up the highlights a bit brighter again on the non-metallic gold. Nothing too fancy really. I'm just again pretty much just going over areas that have already been highlighted with the Balor brown. So now I'm using ice yellow. There might be one or two areas on the skull where you may need a bridge color between the ice yellow and the Balor brown. It's unlikely. But maybe on the forehead and on the big cylinder part at the top, you'll want an extra transition color. But as long as you paint it in a slightly scratchy, stipply way, the transition should still work okay. The main thing is just to make sure that you don't, as you're applying the ice yellow, just make sure you don't go over all of the Balor brown. So you still have some of that yellowy colour there. The Balor brown is the most important colour in terms of adding the yellow to the gold. If you just have XV88 and then go into ice yellow, one, you're going to have a way too big tonal jump, but also it's not going to look very gold. It's going to look a lot cooler and less saturated, pretty much. And the reason I say that is because you could add ice yellow to the XV88 to get like a transition color instead of using Balor brown, but you won't have something that's quite as yellow as Balor brown when you do that. But I mean, that's not to say that you can't make a really nice shiny non-metallic color by doing that. It just won't be that gold when you do it. But sometimes you want like a more desaturated gold. So you can make a gold, but it would entirely depend on the look of the sort of the atmosphere that you want to create with that gold. Like sometimes a really yellow gold looks better, sometimes a really desaturated, almost black and white with just a hint of warmth to it, type gold. Or you can have like greeny gold as well. I did that on the trim for Nagash. That went very heavily green. It looks quite cool as well. You can see on the shaft part here of the non-metallic gold part of the axe, how it's brighter at the top, and then as you get further down towards his hand, it just becomes duller. So that keeps all the focus on the top, the interesting part of the axe, and also saves you having to paint it. So there's not really too much left to do on the model now. I'm pretty much just going to be adding a couple more little white highlight dots just to get that sort of bling parts, high contrast, just to really make parts pop out. If you wanted to fix some of the transitions or add a little bit more saturation in there, you could take some Mournfang brown and water that down and just glaze over the darker areas. That'll take away some of so anywhere that's left showing black primer, that'll fix that, but it will mean that you don't get quite as high contrast, so the white areas don't pop out quite as much, but it does make the transitions look neater. By glazing over them as well, it makes everything sort of blend together, so any of the scratchy marks that you put on or anything that looks a little bit messy, it will make it look a lot neater. And then if you want to make it, the dark areas really dark, and you can take it to Rhinox hide or whatever. But that it's purely if you want to do that. I don't think it's that necessary because it's so hyper detailed on this part of the axe that the detail helps with. It basically makes it lots and lots of really small areas that you're painting. The smaller the area, the fewer transitions you need, just because there isn't the space to show them. You can't see them anyway, so there's no point in painting all these complex transitions because they just won't be visible. There's not enough space to get the transitions into the light volume areas. Remember, when you're painting something shiny, the transitions are right at the edge of the transitions from the bright highlight to the mid-tone or the shadow. So if you're talking like a fraction of a millimeter area where you're going to get that transition in, it's not worth it. And again, just putting in a few more white dots here and there, just on the brightest points. Don't go too crazy with the white dots. Don't put them on everything. Really focus on the skull, the face part of the skull. That's the most important part to make it look nice and bright and white. Because that's where you want your eyes to be drawn. I'm just going back and just putting in now some bounce highlights. I think I mentioned this quite early on in the video. These are entirely optional as well. Some people tell you that they should be on there to make it accurate. It depends if you like them or not. Sometimes I think they look a bit rubbish, but it is an extra detail, so it can be interesting to have them. And this is, again, just going back with the X388, anything, pretty much just keep them to the dark areas. Don't put them on anything where it's a bright highlight. So you see at the front of the skull, don't put any there because they would be overpowered by the bright highlight glint of the little specular highlight there. Anywhere with a dark highlight, then a dark highlight, like a sort of a dark part of the non-metallic steel part of the blade, having a little, I was going to say like a line. You want to try and disguise it as a line. It should be a bit softer than that, but because it's such a small area, you probably will just end up with a line. If you want, you can paint in a line, then mix in some of the X388 with one of the darker colours, or maybe even just a bit of black, and then you get like a little soft transition. And you can also, in a couple of areas, if you want to push the highlights, add a bit of Balor brown in, but don't go any higher than that. And that's pretty much it. Like, you can spend a bit longer if you want, just if you see a few areas that need to be glazed just to make them neater, particularly on the cutting edge of the blade. I think I might have just glazed it a little bit more there. But apart from that, that's pretty much it, and that's the end of this video, which is pretty handy because my voice is about to go. But yeah, so there's, I think, maybe one more or two more videos if I do the base for this model to go, and then I'll be on to something else. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.